With us tonight are three of the region's politicians. Peter Bone is the Conservative MP for Wellingborough. For Labour we have Gavin Shuker, who's the MP for Luton South, and the self-styled voice of Colchester, Sir Bob Russell, is here for the Liberal Democrats. Welcome all. Peter Bone, the first fully Conservative budget for nearly 19 years. George Osborne talked about tax cuts, but actually this was a budget that raised taxes, wasn't it?
Well, I thought it was pretty...
£6.5 billion a year.
I think it was a pretty unusual budget. It was a really bold and radical budget, and what we've done is brought in a living wage at a much higher level than minimum wage, and we've reduced tax credits. And that's the right thing to do. And it's all to do, actually, with getting people into job and into work. And I think the social... You saw here in Duncan Smith cheering at because it's part of the radical reform of changing our society. This really wasn't about pound, shillings and pence.
Wouldn't you like to see lower taxes, though?
Well, no, I should have picked you up and said I don't agree with you, because there are lower taxes. Of course, we've cut...
But overall, this is a tax-raising budget, isn't it?
We've cut income tax, we cut corporation tax. So there's lots of things we do. And obviously, the more people we get into work, the more people pay tax. So it actually is good for the people getting into job. I mean, this is about not so much the economics, but social change, and I hope my colleagues will welcome that.
Gavin Shuker, the Labour manifesto said there would be a national minimum wage of £8 by 2020. The Conservatives have gone further and promised £9.
Well, actually, we promised to increase the minimum wage, which, by the way, is what George Osborne's really done, despite all his rebranding.
But despite what he talks about, it's still higher pay, isn't it?
Also to introduce a national living wage and incentives to do that. We've got an awkward compromise now, halfway between the two. So I welcome the half that George Osborne has come. But you're absolutely right. This was a budget which is going to hurt people more than it helps. This is a budget where, for example, if you're a single earner in a household, you've got 2 kids, you're going to be £2,000 worse off next year. It's the poorest in our society that are paying the cost of this. So don't get caught up in the spin. George Osborne has put a big tax increase on many working families.
So, Bob Russell, your party, of course, were in coalition government for the past 5 years. Are these the kind of welfare cuts that the Liberal Democrats wouldn't let the Conservatives get away with before?
Precisely. We've had 5 years of a coalition government where the Liberal Democrats in the coalition were able to stop the worst excesses of the Conservatives. Look, we have a Conservative government now. Why should people be surprised you have a Conservative budget? This is what they do when they have the power to do it. So the Liberal Democrats, the Liberal Democrats were in government coalition, were able to help restore this nation's finances after the mess left by the last Labour government, and now the Conservatives are governing alone. We should not be surprised if a Conservative government has a Conservative budget.
To be clear, this was an emergency budget to deal with the £90 billion budget deficit inherited from George Osborne in the first place. You know, on their own economic measures, they've completely failed. They're going to reduce the deficit over 10 years rather than over 4, and that isn't a part of our discussion either.
Lots to talk about. Let's just pause for a moment and take a look at a few of the other measures announced in the budget. Here's David Hughes again with the details.
Working age benefits are frozen for 4 years, with the income threshold for tax credits down to under £4,000 from the current level of over £6,000. Child tax credits will become limited to the first 2 children. Student maintenance grants will be scrapped and replaced by loans. The threshold of what you can earn before you start paying tax will go up to £12,500 by 2020. And the government says it's taking the family home out of inheritance tax by raising the threshold to £1 million. There was a pledge to increase defence spending to 2% of GDP to meet NATO targets. And car tax remains frozen, with a plan for a fund to ensure that that money is spent on improving the road network.
Peter Bone, is it a case of sort of taking with one hand and giving with the other? The IFS have said today that 13 million families will be, on average, £260 a year worse off. Many of those will be families living in Wellingborough, won't they?
Well, all budgets do that. Of course, they put up taxes, they take taxes down. But the
IFS say it's taking from the poorer families and the families who are in work as well.
What I'd like to see is in practice, and in my view, what you're going to do, what's going to happen is more people are going to get jobs, less people are going to claim welfare, and it's not just the fact that they're going to be better off because they've got jobs and going to be paying taxes. The family unit will be better off. What used to, I'm sure colleagues had this problem. People would come into your constituency surgery and say, I'm on benefits, I want more benefits. Then they never seem to come in and think there was a possibility of getting a job. hopefully with the living wage
Many of
brought
these people
in,
are working people, though, aren't they? They're just working in extremely low-paid jobs.
yeah, but that's the whole point of the living wage now. It's going to go up. So instead of employers effectively being subsidised by tax credits, we're going to have people paid the right wage, and in return there's going to be less benefit payments. Now that seems to be that's a huge change, but it's the right change, and I think we should see it in practice. This is just not messing about. This is a fundamental change in how we live our daily lives.
Gavin Shuker, we saw what Douglas Carswell had to say earlier. Gordon Brown invented this whole scheme of tax credits. It's costing the taxpayer £30 billion this year. Isn't it right that we should try and shift some of that burden onto businesses? They should pay for people's wages rather than taxpayers.
Absolutely.
And isn't this a way of doing it?
Sadly, if it went all the way to that point, or even if the Chancellor could say, I can't do it this year, but here's a plan to get to a genuine living wage, I think we'd welcome it with open arms. The problem here is that the things that have been put in place in this budget are going to hurt the poorest in our society. We judge budgets based on whether or not they're regressive. In other words, whether they hit the poorest harder than the richest. And it's really clear, the numbers coming out 24 hours down the line, that it's those that are in work who are on poverty wages that are going to be hit the hardest. Why is it George Osborne went out of his way to say he was doing the opposite? It's a sleight of hand, and I think it's wrong.
Bob Russell, another pay freeze or pay rise freeze for the public sector. That's going to be tough for a lot of nurses and doctors and teachers, and that was something that started off. It was even tougher under the coalition government, wasn't it?
And police officers, a whole raft of public sector workers. The national newspapers today about pay rise for Britain. Well, it's not a pay rise for public sector workers, but I repeat, this is a Conservative government with a Conservative budget. I don't see why people...
But this was happening under the coalition government wasn't it?
We were there to temper, to ensure that we did not have a full-blown Conservative fiscal regime. We had fairness and firmness. That's the whole point. You've now lost the fairness because the Conservatives are able to govern. But let's be quite blunt about it. This is how Conservative governments behave. I can't see why people are surprised. They're in there to help the few, not the many. On the inheritance tax, it's only going to benefit 6% of the population. 6% of the population. What about the other 94%?
Peter Bone, how many people in Wellingborough do you think live in a house worth more than £1 million?
Nobody.
So it won't benefit anyone in your constituency?
No, what it will be is you won't have to pay inheritance tax. That's the simple point.
But effectively, people in Wellingborough will be paying for other people
No, you won't have to pay a death tax. That's the point. And that's what we said we would do. And that's what people want to see. And I can't understand Bob. I mean, if Bob was in government to stop us introducing a living wage, I'm not sure how that works, because that means the poorest people in society get more money. We've taken them out of tax as well. So, I mean, is that what the Liberals are doing, stopping us bringing those measures?
Well, actually, it was the Liberal Democrat policy to raise the level to £10,000 where people pay income tax.
It was the Conservative. We're the majority and we brought it in, Bob.
Well, I recognise that, but it was part of the
coalition agreement. To be fair, it was a Liberal Democrat policy. It was in the Liberal Democrat manifesto. It's yours now, yes.
This is a myth. This is like the EU is good for you. It's one of those myths. It is a Conservative policy to increase threshold, take people out of tax and cut taxes for everyone. Because it's not just the lower earners. Everyone will benefit by the allowance being raised. It cuts taxes, gives more money to people who are in work at a living wage, and cuts benefits. Now that seems to me to be a pretty good package.
But it doesn't cut taxes if taxes are rising by £6.5 billion every year, does it? It doesn't cut taxes for everyone.
Well,
in general, taxes are going up.
Tell me which taxes are going up then.
Well, there'll be more taxes taken.
In particular, the very group that George Osborne said, I agree with Bob, actually. Elections do have consequences, and we are seeing them now. If you are young, in particular, and going to university, or if you're poor, or if you don't have enough money in your pocket, even though you're working all the hours that you're meant to be doing it, this is a bad budget for you. Now, you can present it in any particular way you want to, and George Osborne's very impressive on the politics. He's very poor on the economics, however.
Which taxes are going up?
Well, it's pretty obvious which taxes are going up. If you receive any of your tax back through tax credits, you're going to get hit.
Tax credit. You said taxes were going up. The only tax that I think I heard going up was
taxes will be raised. That's what the IMF says.
This is the whole point. You pay people more money, therefore you get more taxing. That's exactly right, and that's how it should be. Instead of people being as you rightly said, companies being subsidised and those people not paying any taxes. What we're doing is paying them more money, making companies pay them a living wage. They then get taxed on that, and therefore you get more tax take. It's a very sensible...
Forgive me, I know it's circular as an argument, but people will not have as much money as a result of this budget than they had before, particularly if they're poor or they're in work.
And I think what will happen is people will get a job at the minute, so they'll get this job on this low level, and then they will start to get better jobs and more money. I think it's exactly the way forward.
We do need to pay off the deficit, though. That's what lots of politicians say. Do you agree with this fiscal charter that the economy should be in surplus?
Yeah, I've got no problems with us being in surplus in normal times. Sadly, George Osborne seems to. He's actually changed the framework by which he's going to hold himself to account 5 times in the past 2 years with different votes. It's smoke and mirrors again.
Bob Russell, should the economy be in surplus in the good times?
Well, of course it should, because if we hadn't have taken the action we did 5 years ago in the coalition, I won't say we would have headed where Greece has gone, but we've certainly headed where Spain is. And therefore, I think the fairness which the Liberal Democrats brought to the coalition meant that the economy is well on the way to being fixed. Unfortunately, the electorate didn't see it that way, and to paraphrase Private Eye, they didn't like what the organ grinder was doing, so they shot the monkey. Well, they are not going to like what the organ grinder is doing on his own now.
Let's just leave it there for a moment. Another